Welcome back to Catholic Messenger Conversations, our monthly podcast with Bishop Thomas Zinkula. I am Barbara Arlen Fye, your host. Today's podcast topic is the mayhem that took place inside the U.S. Capitol on January 6th and how we move forward with it. Bishop, about a month ago, before the attack, Pope Francis issued his World Day of Peace message. He said the COVID-19 crisis aggravated deeply integrated crises coupled with a surge in various forms of nationalism, racism, and xenophobia, and wars and conflicts that bring about death and destruction in their wake. How surprised were you by what happened on January 6th?
Well, very surprised on the one hand, but kind of not so much on the other when you think about what the chatter that was on the internet and just, thinking back on it, gosh, we shouldn't have been so surprised that this happened because there was lots of anger out there, lots of talk about this gathering, but still, it still did catch me by surprise ultimately.
When did you hear about the news? I think you were blessing a linear accelerator in Clinton, weren't you, at the time this all broke out?
Yeah, so that was around the middle of the day, and it's actually on my way back from that. I was listening to the radio and I heard about this riot and attack, and then when I got back to the Chancery, Deacon David, the Chancellor Montgomery, has office next door, and he was listening to it, watching on the television, and so then I went to his office and kind of watched it for a while, and we were chatting about it.
Wow.
So, but you talked about the COVID-19 crisis. And quoted what the Pope said about that in his peace message. I was thinking about that. He also talked about crisis in a talk that he gave to the Curia. Kind of at the end of the year, he addresses them, and he talked about crisis there. He said crisis it can help renewal. It's actually can be a good thing. Or it can morph into conflict, which creates discord. Right. So it's just that whole idea, like tension. We're so afraid of tension, but it can be healthy. Tension can be a good thing.
Right.
Actually, depending on what you do with it, and it can bring out the good or it can bring out the bad in us when we're stressed and there's challenges that we're facing. So it can be a crisis, which can be ultimately actually be a good thing, or that can degenerate into conflict and creating discourse. So he was saying like the pandemic can be beneficial actually to us if we make it an opportunity for conversion, by allowing ourselves to be led by the Spirit with courage and humility. But if the crisis is seen as a conflict, it will create discord, competition, and enemies. So that's what's happening. There's been this tension, this crisis that we've been facing, in our nation, and we're seeing it in that situation in Washington. It had become a conflict. It had gotten to that, into that sort of a thing.
Do you think it kind of got out of control? Do you think, it made me think of, and it was much more serious than this, but a school food fight. I mean, when sometimes, it begins as something like, yeah, let's really get them razzed up, and then all of a sudden it becomes an all-out.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like sociological thing that happens where a crowd and people get caught up in it. I think that was probably part of it, for sure.
And because some people are thinking there's way more sinister aspects to it with the white power movement or white supremacy. And I'm wondering, I mean,
it's
maybe
probably
that's...
both. I mean, there's more and more information that's coming our way about this, and facts, and that lot, it was planned. There was some planning, definitely. There was some of that. How much of that was there? So there's that, but then there's also probably people who were there that weren't part of that planning, just got caught up with the
kind of like a polar
energy.
Vortex in a way.
Right.
Well, I'm wondering, people on both sides are experiencing fear, perhaps fear of losing freedom of speech because of actions that Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms have taken in identifying and or taking down certain posts, perhaps fear of democracy falling, perhaps fear for their own lives. How can people cope with some of these worst case fears And how can they communicate with people who may not share these fears?
So first of all, with regard to fear, as you've heard before probably or read, and I've maybe said before, maybe even on this podcast, that word fear, or do not be afraid, that kind of a thing.
Right.
In the Bible, it's 365 times in there. That we hear the most from God the Father and Jesus. And so why is that? Because it's there are those who say fear is opposite of faith. We think about doubt. Well, first maybe that begins with fear, and then fear leads to doubt. And so when we're afraid, why is that? Why does God need to speak to us? Why does Jesus need to speak to us so much about fear? It's a dangerous thing because it can bring out the worst in us, honestly, and we're not at our best in those situations. And fear feeds on itself, I think.
Yeah, I think it's
and
so
it multiplies when it's shared. It's magnified when it's shared. Maybe that whole thing with the capital, and it can lead to frenzy. That's why it's so dangerous and violence. So what do we do about that? Well, I don't know. We've been talking about Pope Francis. And what does he talk about a lot? Encountering each other rather than in our little camps. Actually, talking to each other, dialoguing, listening, not just talking.
Right.
And accompaniment, walking with each other. You see that a little bit, here and there in the Congress, but not enough.
I realized that because last night I was talking with a relative, and I knew both of us are afraid of something, but we have different, I think maybe different ideas of what it is we're trying to, I think we both want the same thing, but we have fears that on different aspects of how that is not going to happen, or and so, but I did listen. I mean, we had a conversation for about an hour, and so it's hard sometimes. It's hard to listen because you want to interject. You want to say, but.
Right.
And so that's really, really hard.
Yeah, you're right. But if we were seeking the truth, who has all the answers by themselves?
Right.
There's just, what is truth anymore? There's all this stuff that people just run with, and wherever that in the spectrum. But we should be seeking truth together and trying to sort that out.
Exactly. And I'm wondering, Pope Francis refers to in his peace statement the common good, which is a sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. How do we deal with conflicting viewpoints on how to achieve the common good? I'm thinking about last night with my conversation. I know that my relative wants what's best for everyone. I want what's best for everyone, but we just don't, we think that the way to get there, we have a conflicting viewpoint on the way to get there. Maybe that's it. How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah, right. And I don't have all the answers, but but I would say, we do need to be doing that, talking and encountering, talking, walking together, but maybe we need to begin with ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? And with prayer and reflection, and be honest about things, and look at ourselves before we look at others and where they're at with things. I mean, this whole thing with seeing the plank in our own eyes before we look at the splinter in the eyes of someone else. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi once said, this is a real popular thing that he said, "You must be the change you want to see in the world." All right?
Yeah.
So it reminds me of this story one time I told when I was the rector of the seminary in Dubuque. And these guys, the seminarians, razzed me about this ever after, including to this day. But they remember the point I made. So in this story, so there's this, you maybe heard this story before, there's an old Indian chief who's with his grandson, and he decides he's going to teach his grandson a life lesson. And so he's saying, within each of us there are two wolves, right, that are battling.
Yeah.
There's the good wolf that represents beauty and goodness and kindness and love and joy and all that. And then there's the bad wolf that represents hatred and anger and evil and all the dark stuff. And they're battling within each of us. And the little grandson is all taken up into this. And, Grandpa, which wolf wins? And the Indian chief says, whichever one you feed.
Yeah.
So to take a look at ourselves before we encounter a dialogue with others, but which one am I feeding? Actually, am I feeding the fruits and gifts of the Holy Spirit, or am I feeding the 7 capital sins or whatever?
Right.
I think, and then, just to start with ourselves and then reach out to others. I think we'd be in a better place and we could hear each other better, if we do that.
Exactly. On the way here, I was listening to, on the radio, the hearing on the impeachment. The U.S. House was holding the impeachment hearing. And it occurred to me, you get to listen to each side share their thoughts about, why this is a good idea or not a good idea. And what was very helpful to me was you can listen to what each person is saying. And that was very helpful to me, because it's not fake news, it's not the truth, it's what people are perceiving.
Right, and not being interrupted. Oh yeah,
right.
But what about this? Just hear me out and just,
And so that was helpful to me, because I didn't agree with everything that everyone was saying, and yet it helped me to have to listen to someone else's perspective about something. And I thought, hey, that person made a good point that I wouldn't have, that I wouldn't necessarily have agreed with, but that I can understand and accept.
Right, but we don't have, that doesn't happen as much as it used to, I don't think, in terms of like on the news and talk shows, whatever, they're people are interrupting each other constantly, and it gets loud, and and even in everyday conversation, sometimes we don't hear each other out and just give people the floor for a chunk of time.
There was a priest who texted me the other day, and he said, I don't really see news anymore on television. It's all opinion. It seems like all of the whatever broadcast he's listening to, people are pontificating about their viewpoints as opposed to sharing the news. And I wonder if, and my relative, for example, says social media is the problem. And social media, I think, does feed into this. But I'm not sure what we do about that. I mean, that certainly is not helping to bring about dialogue.
No, it's not. I mean, I was thinking about, like, the Pope talks a lot about gossip. He brings it up a lot in his homilies and things, and how dangerous it is. He's really onto that. He has his reasons for why that's, probably life experience, whatever. But social media and that kind of a thing, those kinds of newscasts, it kind of ends up being kind of gossip, Right. You're sharing this stuff, whatever you think about something, and as if it's the gospel truth, and it interferes. There's all this stuff about that's fake news and this and that. Why is that? Why can't people try to be more objective about things? And
even some of the bishops and priests have gotten in, though, on that social media and gotten political.
Both sides.
Yeah. And how do you respond to something like that?
No, it's a problem. It definitely is a problem. I think we need to talk about it. People are afraid to deal with that, but
do you think that's something that U.S. bishops need to address?
There are some who say that, yeah.
At the conference.
Yeah.
I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, what do you do about that? I mean, we're independent in a sense. Bishops the conference can't tell you what to do. That's this joint thing. If we all are unanimous on something, fine. But otherwise, as a bishop,
but they seem to have more clout.
Well, yeah, right.
Yeah.
But I'd like to think that it doesn't have to be a public thing. That's not our way anyway.
Right.
It's a private conversation, fraternal correction.
Right.
Who is to do that with a bishop, or the priest obviously should be his bishop, but with a bishop,
right.
Who's that to do that? I don't know. There's nobody. The Pope, well, he's not going to do that. He's the first among equals. So it's an issue for us in terms of how, hopefully, we're brothers, and we would reach out. Just it's scriptural, if there's somebody that you think is off base, that you should reach out to them and talk to them and try to help them along.
That's a tough one, I think. The Pope had talked about also that we need to examine our consciences, which you're kind of talking about in a way too. He had no idea that people would be storming the U.S. Capitol. I'm guessing, so what, in this case, what should examination of conscience entail?
So there's, Bishop Robert Barron is a popular figure in the church. And he actually, after the storming of the Capitol, kind of shortly thereafter, he had a little clip that he called a video. He called "We Need a National Examination of Conscience," and he kind of what he's saying there. He said there's a lot of violence. There's been a lot of violence this past year. People attacking our institutions, and that it occurs across the ideological spectrum. And he said, people are refusing to engage in real argument or discussion or civil discourse, and that's resulted, they've resorted to violence instead. And so that's, he talks about that a lot, about just civil discourse and real argument. And he said some of the best qualities of our democracy are grounded in deeply religious principles, like, equality, freedom, the dignity of the individual, the human person. And he said, so then he ends up with all of us really need to look at the way we deal with our disputes. He doesn't say how to do that exactly. I mean, I've talked about just now, prayer and reflection and looking at ourselves first and then, encounter and dialogue and, it's nice to talk about those things. How do you exactly put those into practice? But at least we should try, and in informal ways with each other, just family members and friends and acquaintances, and then maybe we need a more structured way to do that. Maybe the church can lead in that. I mean, there's things that we have tried along the way with those kinds of things, like Civilize It. That program was geared towards that. Did
anyone pay attention to that Civilized program? Doesn't sound like it.
Well, that's hard. Yeah, I don't know. How do you gauge that?
Yeah. Because there's been nothing but animosity in these last 9 weeks since the election.
Right. Well, right. So,
right.
Right.
I guess
so Civilize It, it's going to solve everything.
We can still practice it.
Maybe it would have been worse.
That's right. Maybe what we need to do is it's kind of like they say in broadcasting, you need to repeat a message, or in advertising, you need to repeat a message 7 times at least before it sinks in. So maybe we just need to keep reminding people, here's what Civilize It means.
Yeah, the process is, I was just talking about that this morning at this, directors meeting we had, that we can roll out all this stuff, these great programs and things, and so what, how do we need a process for it. You need to, it's easy kind of to do that, but what's the work of getting people on board with that and doing something with these things, whatever it is that we want them to do.
It's almost like people want, maybe we all want a step-by-step diagram. Okay, how do we engage in civil conversation with people who are so diametrically opposed to how do we get people together?
There was some of that. I've heard about, I don't want to give you exact examples, but there was some of that where people actually were brought to, somehow came together with very different, on different poles of things.
Yeah. And so then, I guess, what is the best way to hold people accountable for their actions that led to the rioting? What's your thought on that?
I don't know. It's, there's a criminal justice system. That's what we have for that. It's a good system, and they're trying to use that system now in Washington. You've been hearing about these grand juries and and people being arrested, and they're going through the process. That's what we have for this sort of a thing. So we just need to use that system.
And at what point? There were probably some insurrectionists, some people who were like the ringleaders of
Yeah.
this thing.
Right. So they're kind of saying, so far it's been a lot of misdemeanors. They've been saying that they're gonna be looking at those things too. They can always add more charges, but they're saying with the leaders, they're looking at those kinds of charges, which would be an everyday thing, you
Right.
know. So it's a newer thing that they're going to have to sort out. But that's what it's in place for. I mean, there was a siege on our democracy. Well, in our democracy, we have
There's consequences to pay for that.
Yeah.
What about, some people, are using now all the video that came out to like rat on people they don't like maybe, or coworkers, and people are getting fired and social media sites are getting shut down. And so some people are crying out, you're trying to quash people's voice. What do you think about that? It's not a violation of the First Amendment because it's a private business, but so what do you think? I mean, social media has served good and bad.
Yeah, it's always complicated. It's probably some of those situations, it's unfortunate and it's not right. In other situations, well, you did go into the Capitol and you did do whatever you did that was destructive, so, and whether, people's motives for why they bring that to the attention of law enforcement, who knows? It's good and bad, but ultimately they whatever they did.
Right.
And so there's a criminal justice, and then in terms of the civil arena with jobs and things, you'd have to look at each particular situation. Probably there's been some,
well, I think, for instance, the guy with the horns on his head, he was pretty much calling attention to himself.
Yeah, well,
and the war paint.
Yeah, but so what? There's nothing wrong with, we can do that outside the Capitol too. That in and of itself isn't a crime. It's
right.
Whatever else he did while he was in there, just being in there, the breaking and entering thing and whatever.
Exactly. Pope Francis speaks about a grammar of care, commitment to promoting the dignity of each human person, solidarity with the poor and vulnerable, the pursuit of the common good, and concern for the protection of creation. How do we convince people to see these issues as non-political?
So I think it's more challenging these days, honestly. Why is there so much focus on politics and everything? And I think part of it is just in terms of secularism. We don't have, a shared moral framework anymore as much, right, that we used to have. People, drifting away from organized religion, and then with individualism, where we're less concerned about the common good. We're more concerned about ourselves. With this pandemic, you hear that about a lot. It's about me, kind of a thing. And I could give different examples of that. And versus what about this other person who's vulnerable? Whatever.
Right. Yeah.
So it's So that's, and then the natural law. Okay, that's not religious based, but it's the natural order of things. So there's that we could print out. The church puts that out there too, but people don't kind of focus on that as much. So I think it more and more issues then land in the political arena and the judicial arena. So that's where we do our battles. Then it's all they solve everything for us. Since we're not on the same page, or even in the same book.
Right.
Out here in the country. So then you guys sort this out and do our battles there. And so what do you do about that? We've been focusing on evangelization. So there's that, and then there's the joy of the gospel. Okay, well, maybe we're not going to convert everybody, but to present another vision, a gospel vision. I got to think people, all of us, when we're going at this in a conflictual way and disrespectful way, you don't feel good about that.
No.
So I think we pay attention to and even when we're arguing with people,
right.
When does that get to the point where this is not healthy, this is not holy, and then there's got to be another way, So that as a church, we should be able to present that other way.
Right.
And we're not doing a good enough job about that. I don't think. If we're not together, if we're not together even as a church, how can we do that very authentically?
Well, and even as a church, some people have different viewpoints about about church teachings even, and so I think we need to.
At least we don't have to believe all exactly the same thing about.
Right.
I mean, obviously the teaching of the church, the core teachings, but in terms of these issues out in society, okay, fine, we can have different opinions on things, but there are some core things that we need to be together on, and even with those things that we disagree on, we need to listen to each other and be respectful about those things and people who differ with us on those things.
And it's easier to start that with relatives because you love them, and it's like, hey, I want to keep this relationship going. I don't want to shut the door.
Yeah.
So I'm willing to listen more when I'm, with people. Maybe that's where we start.
We had just this morning on my family, we have this ongoing texting thing, kind of, and there were people in different places. So one of my family members, siblings, said, we need to talk about these things. We've been avoiding this. We have talked about it, but then it gets heated, and so then we just let's not talk about it. And so this family member was saying we need to talk about it, and somebody else was like, yeah, but maybe not like right now. Let's let Biden be inaugurated, and then maybe it's better one-on-one versus like there's 9 of us, 9 siblings, so. Maybe it's better one-on-one. So we've been kind of talking about that sort of a thing, just in my own family.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think we need to do that. I had sort of a disagreement with one of my siblings, and yet, he came back on Facebook and was lifting me up about something else completely different. And it's like, boy, that changed my tune.
Yeah, I mean, you start with
attitude towards him,
right? But maybe start with what you have in common, what you agree on,
right,
versus going automatically to.
Yeah, that's a good point. We need to keep focusing on that, don't we? What we have in common. We just really need to keep bringing that message home.
Yeah, I mean that's way more than these few things that we disagree on.
Exactly. So, I guess I'm wondering too. We have a responsibility to meet the needs through this coronavirus pandemic, through all of the crises of the Capitol. We still have people who are poor and sick and excluded. How are their needs being affected in this time, do you think? Do you think this has made it even more complicated?
Yeah, no, it definitely has. I mean, even though I was talking about that address that the Pope gave to the Curia, and he said there that the coronavirus has exposed our vulnerability and uncovered those false and superfluous certainties, and uncovered once more our belonging to one another as brothers and sisters. So yeah, things like climate change. And Pope Francis talked about this in Laudato Si, his encyclical. These things highlight weaknesses, inequalities, inequities, vulnerabilities, and the poor and those in the margins always take the brunt of things, right? Yeah. And so that's not a good thing. And hopefully we see that more and more, and we're open to seeing that, and it bothers us more and more. And we recognize, as the Pope says, that our belonging to one another as brothers and sisters, that we're all in this together. And, we need to be most focused on those on the peripheries, the preferential option for the poor and all of that. And so that's the common good. They're a part of the common good. If we're focused on the common good, here's a part of the common good that's really hurting the most. So let's all shift things over towards them and together and reach out to them and help them along the way.
Yeah.
In some manner, depending on the situation.
Awesome. Well, I'm just wondering, do you have any final shots? Any not shots, I guess it would be parting thoughts that you'd like to share?
Just that, Barb, you are the best editor of any Catholic newspapers in this whole country. Just want to say that online, whatever.
It's perfect.
No, seriously, you do a great job. No, we just got to keep together on things, and
That's
we
right.
can't be. It's just not. It's not. It's destructive that we're
Right.
fighting and arguing, and we can disagree, but we're just not doing it in the right way.
That's right. Okay.
And so our faith should inform that. In terms of whether this kind of thing brings out the best or the worst in us, as I've been saying. If we're people of faith truly, and we're gospel people, then it should bring out the best in us.
Right.
We not the worst in us, and that was what happened at the Capitol, was bring out the worst in people. So hopefully we can learn from that. We can hit bottom. One of my siblings says, hopefully as a nation we've hit bottom now. With this.
Yeah,
honestly,
where are we going to go?
And then you have to do that, right? And before you start, you start building things up again.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
Oh, great. Thanks, Bishop. We'll see you
You're
next
welcome.
month for a great
Sure.
topic.
Thank you. It's been a
Okay,
pleasure.
thank you.